Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 1. Progeny of Hate. Chapter 19. Homecoming. Evrain eased himself onto a bench and stretched out his legs. The many cuts on his arms and upper body caused him great discomfort, and he frowned to think that a pack of mound-dwellers could have inflicted such injury on him. But then he had to admit that a nightshirt was hardly fitting attire for a scrap with murderous rogues and their sharp steel. He was fortunate to be alive. Lur sat down across from him, stifling a groan. His head still hurt furiously, and he wanted nothing more than to rest his battered body in bed. His left arm was immobilized with a sling, for a dirty moundsman blade had penetrated deeply into his shoulder. Despite the odds that had been ranged against them, he was mortified that he had been overcome before help had arrived. He felt old and tired beyond his 48 cycles. He motioned with his eyes across the hallway and addressed the man opposite him.
"There he is."
Evrain looked up and smiled to himself. Their Nurian captive was quite a picture now, dressed as a page of the Aranite court, ironically displaying the pale yellow staked cross on the emerald green surcoat, the battle insignia of his nation's mortal enemy. He could easily pass for an Aranite lad from a distance, and that was the intention, of course. The high collar masked most of the bad bruising on his throat and neck. The cut on his cheek and temple had been cleaned and neatly stitched. Even the swelling on his lower lip had diminished since the night before. He had to have an exceptional resilience and constitution. But then he was one of those mysterious and enigmatic wizards from across the pass. It was difficult not to feel their otherness at times. Gareth seemed small and insignificant beside the tall and muscular West March guard that accompanied him. He hardly reached to the man's chest. Evrain wondered why someone would be so eager to get rid of a harmless child. The guard steered Gareth towards the seated men. The boy brightened when he saw them, and smiled lopsidedly as he passed between them. He sat down next to Evrain, appearing to be in the highest of spirits.
"You amaze me."
He glanced at the boy.
"If I had your cycles, and so many close encounters with death,"
He shook his head.
"I expected you to be trembling and tearful by now, with shattered nerves."
Gareth looked at him with a puzzled expression.
"We won, didn't we?"
His voice was a little hoarse. Both men burst out laughing. Lur clapped him on the shoulder.
"That we did, boy.
He was smiling broadly.
And no small thanks to ye. I saw the heroics ye performed. If all the lads in Uria are as brave as ye, it would be best if we make peace right away."
Gareth flushed scarlet. He was grateful that Lur had not also seen him hesitating in front of the open doorway, contemplating flight.
"Some heroics. That big man had no trouble strangling me."
He coughed painfully. The double doors at the far end of the hallway opened abruptly, and the breathless page appeared. He hurried over to the seated group and bowed to Evrain. Gareth was astonished. He had heard of this mortifying foreign custom, but never seen it performed so blatantly. He was embarrassed for the boy's sake.
"King Ranald will see you now, Captain Evrain. Please follow me."
The page bowed again and turned on his heel. Evrain rose to his feet.
"Here, boy."
The page turned back expectantly.
"Does the king desire to see me first, or the three of us together?"
The boy annoyingly bowed again. Gareth wondered how he got through the day without straining his back.
"May it please you, sir, King Ranald desires to see all three."
Here he looked directly at Gareth with an expression somewhere between awe and loathing. He bit his lip nervously and fell to staring at the foreigner, who seemed normal after all, dressed the same as he was, and quite docile. Gareth wondered whether the Aranite tutors were as maliciously slanted as the ones in Uria. He made an effort to smile at the lad, who after a moment's hesitation smiled in return. King Ranald received them in his council room, which they entered through the door leading off the main banquet hall. He was a young man, Gareth saw, with piercing blue eyes and shoulder-length russet brown hair. He wore a neatly trimmed beard and thin mustache underneath a rather prominent nose. He frowned at them as they came in, not a frown of displeasure, but rather of puzzlement. Evrain, Lur, and the tall guard followed the example of the page, and bowed from the waist down. Gareth halted in consternation, not wanting to seem disrespectful, and yet unable to bring himself to this show of servility. Ranald acknowledged the homage of his subjects with a nod, all the while looking at the stranger from Nuria and smiling to himself. The child looked at him with bewildered apprehension, as if he expected some rebuke or even threat of violence. He was reminded somewhat of a caged falcon he had kept as a boy. This particular one had proved untamable. Its pride and distrust had forced him to release it or see it starve to death. Yet he had admired the spirit of this bird that could not be reduced to thraldom or obedience. He turned to his captain.
"Cousin Evrain, it does me good to see you on the mend, and not too much the worse for wear."
Gareth liked the sound of his voice, which carried a strong suggestion of a scholarly and calculating inclination. This was a man of intelligence, seasoned well with wisdom. It was a surprise, though, to learn of his captor's relation to the king. Evrain was smiling without pretense.
The pleasure of this meeting is mine, my king, since it is by your doing that I am still able to share in it.
"Not altogether true, and certainly you are entitled to my protection as a sworn captain of the realm. But I am bursting with curiosity as to the why and wherefore of your adventures, and how it came about that you acquired a visitor from across the pass."
He motioned to the guard and the page.
"Fionn, make sure we are not disturbed. Trenian, I will not have need of you till after the even meal."
Both turned to obey instantly, but not without a final curious glance in the direction of the stranger. Hardly had the door closed behind them, when Ranald pointed the three to stools before the fire, and installed himself on a high back chair facing them. Evrain introduced Gareth as the runaway younger prince of Nuria he was, and pressed upon him to relate this part of the story with the utmost honesty and accuracy. The boy hesitated at first, though he had agreed to the strategy that morning, since he was unsure of the king, and not entirely willing to relive some of the painful memories. As expected, the listener raised an eyebrow as he reached the part where he encountered Kenath and the subsequent display of power. But when Evrain had taken over the telling and explained the circumstances of his sudden appearing in the pass, Ranald nodded his head in amazed agreement. His frown deepened somewhat as the mound dwellers entered the tale, but he nodded at the end of it as if something had been confirmed to him.
"You should have come to me directly, cousin."
I had no idea you were in the city, sire.
And that proved near disastrous, eh?"
Ranald raised his eyebrows.
It did.
Evrain looked into the eyes of the young king.
But for the timely arrival of your guards, no doubt we would have been food for the crows.
Ranald smiled and looked at his cousin with a genuine appreciation.
"And our realm would have been the poorer for it."
Now he turned to the Viron boy, who had not taken his strange eyes off him during the entire conversation.
"Tell me, Gareth of Nuria, why it is that you attempted to cross the pass to your enemy instead of fleeing to the west and your relatives in Gilreth."
Gareth felt the walls close in on him. Now it would come, the suspicions, the questions, the prison, the exchange. He caught his breath.
I was not sure of where the Count stands. He had done nothing to save his daughter, my mother. For all I know, he is the king's man. If the king wants you dead, where would you hide?
The man seemed unconvinced.
"We are not the barbarians we were at the time of the summoning."
Gareth knew it was some sort of challenge, yet he was unsure how to respond. It was clear that the heinous act of Cale had still not faded from the memory of the men of Arran. And how would it, with 600 cycles of raid and counter-raid, skirmish and all-out war to strengthen it? He remained silent, but held the gaze of the king.
"We are not as trusting as we were either."
Ranald spoke sharply, to provoke the boy.
"What did you expect to find in the country of your enemies? A warm welcome?"
Gareth could read his intention well, but could not prevent the escalation of his own emotional unease.
I did not expect anything. All I wanted was to get away.
The king struck his blow.
Then you will not be too disappointed to know that there is no asylum for you in Arran. You are a prince of the ruling house in Nuria, and I have good reason to believe that the present king, your father, will stop at nothing until my country is either annihilated or enslaved. What part you play in this I am not sure, but I will have none of it.
The tutors were speaking again, telling him not to ask questions about the state of affairs, but rather learn of his enemies and their intentions. What did it matter why they were your opponents? It was sufficient to know of their hatred, to learn of their weakness. This king had been schooled well.
Is it to be prison for me, then? Will you put me in a hole to die, or trade me back to the murderers in Belruth? It matters not.
He looked away.
If you are no better than the liars in Nuria, then it is right that you should destroy each other in this war, for which no one can remember the reason.
The words held no force or even conviction, only a sad resignation. Ranald felt his temper rising. What did this stripling know of wars and causes? What could he understand of the unreasonable fears and hatreds of men? He was not a simple-minded warmonger. Yet to play out the act, he would have to defend these views in a convincing way.
It could be that they have little time for truth in Nuria, and that you are but an ignorant child. The men of Arran did not start this strife, nor do they pursue it with the same passion as their enemies.
Gareth had only gained a little color.
Oh, you have many words. A fine tutor you would make, and yet I hear none of it, for they explain nothing but what you want. I do not think truth can be caught in words. If it can, I have never heard it from a man.
He shrugged.
I have not hurt you, or come here to hurt you, but you will hurt me, for all the reasons you have mentioned, and not for anything that I could do. What must I say to that? To me, there is no sense in it.
He smiled oddly.
Your man
He motioned in Evrain's direction.
has saved me 3 times, so you can destroy me.
His hands were shaking with emotion and fear of this man's reaction to his audacity. Ranald rose to his feet. He spoke softly.
I will not destroy you, but there are men who would do it only to find a reason to hurt others. You can see this? Your father is one of those men, but there are many others who do not agree with him. Yet I cannot allow him to use you to win over his countrymen. You see this also?
Gareth bowed his head.
I see that. But he will not use me again. He wanted me to die.
Yet he knows you are not dead, and he will risk exposing his agents in Arran to make sure that you become so.
Evrain cleared his throat.
If I may, your majesty, the agents among the mound dwellers were not the Nurian kings. The leader of the cutthroats that attacked us here hails from the marshlands of Taralan.
Even so, Malik Julian is an ally of the Nurian king, always has been. They are plotting our downfall, and this child
He pointed to Gareth.
has some part to play in it.
That is true, sire, but the part they have intended for him has to be played with his corpse. While he breathes, their scheme is foiled, is it not?
It appears so, cousin.
He turned to learn the boy.
Wait outside while I make my decision. You were bringing him to me at the rock.
Ranald's voice carried a hint of accusation.
Of course.
Evrain lied without hesitation. It was more than a little disturbing. Just how far was he willing to go to protect this foreign child?
How did you get him past Railf?
Evrain watched the king's frown change into a smile as he related the interview in Grin's Keep. Railf was unequaled in courage and strength, but he more than made up for that with his lack of wit. Ranald stood rubbing his bearded chin at the end of it.
I am beginning to understand the Nurian king's scheming. This boy is the son of his second wife, who, I gather, has cost him some prestige among the nobles with her dabbling in the arcane arts. There's also the possibility of a future claim from Gilreth in the boy's name on the kingship, therefore a potential threat to the firstborn son. Ridding himself of this child could be to his advantage. Blaming the murder on Aaron could be very convenient for his political aims.
He stared intensely at his captain.
This boy cannot die on Aaronite soil.
What will you do?
Evrain kept emotion out of his voice with difficulty. Ranald sighed deeply and turned towards the fire. He spoke slowly, making an effort to order his thoughts.
There is an element in this whole affair that eludes me. I do not appreciate the insidious operating of the agents of unknown powers in my realm. The fact that they are connected to this princeling complicates the matter somewhat, but I may turn this to my advantage with a little good fortune. Yes,
He smiled to himself.
Gilreth must know of his survival, and yet he must be out of their reach also. That is about the only way to neutralize this threat.
He turned swiftly.
Can you keep him safe in Kiel?
Evrain stared at him, suppressing the sudden guilty leap of joy. He would not be forced to break his promise of aid to the boy after all.
I believe so, sire. I have also had assurances from Uthard, for what it's worth.
Yes, an unknown quantity, and one we will not entirely rely on. I will send my own agents in your wake. They will remain out of sight, but near at hand. This is best.
He cast down his eyes.
Evrain, this boy is true. I merely tested him just now, but there is too much mystery around him for my liking. In my mind, he is a threat and an enemy that should be locked away in the darkest, most secret cell in the rock. But something of my instinct warns me against such typically brutal and short-sighted actions of the past. The more I heed this warning, the more my reason provides support for what I have decided.
You have inherited the wisdom of your father, sire.
Ranald smiled dryly.
Do not turn my wisdom into foolishness, cousin. Do not let this boy out of your sight.
Evrain bowed in anticipation of being dismissed, but the king put a hand on his shoulder, restraining him.
There is one other matter. The mound dwellers. How is it that they have grown so bold?
There are these agents among them, your majesty, fueling the fires of their past grudges, playing on their ambitions and downtrodden state.
Yet at least one of these agents has labored on our behalf. A runner from the mounds alerted us to your presence in the city, as well as that of the gang of thugs who assailed you.
The king lowered his voice.
I sense a change in the order of things. This incident only serves to strengthen my suspicions.
He whispered his next words.
You know there's a Viron with us at the moment?
Evrain did not have to pretend surprise.
Here in the city?
The king nodded.
From Gilreth. In secret. It appears that not all of Nuria is willing to support Fengor in his schemes.
Evrain was too astonished to answer. Another twist was added to the mystery. Ranald continued.
He will have to see and assure himself of the identity of this boy before you leave for the south.
I killed a man. In the merchant's meat. I struck him with Lur's knife.
The boy's eyes were large and pleading.
Perhaps he did not die.
I sure hope he did, my boy. That I do.
Lur was adamant.
That was not a man. That was filth, ready to string out your entrails and strangle you with it. His kind should never have been born. Now, you may think perchance he had a wife and he had a child, and you would feel guilt for their sake, but they are far better off without such offal as he was. If indeed he had it in him to father anything but a...
Evrain put a restraining hand on his arm.
We see your point.
He kept his eyes on Gareth, who in turn was staring in some fascination at Lur, as if the wisdom dispensed so bluntly could dispel every misgiving he had. Evrain had wondered when some form of reaction would set in, not being sure it ever would with this strange boy. Now he marveled that Gareth's conscience would be pricked by the ending of such a worthless life.
We cannot be sure that he did, Gareth. But that he deserved it, there is little doubt. You did a noble thing by preventing him from harming Lur any further.
The boy smiled at him a little too quickly.
I did not know it would be so difficult. When you fit an arrow to the bow, you don't think it will pierce someone's flesh.
Evrain reached over and put a hand on his shoulder.
I hope it never becomes any easier for you to do it.
Lur could not help interjecting.
Even if the scum had it coming.
Evrain ignored him.
But don't trouble yourself with it. When you cannot avoid killing, it is justified.
Despite his reassurance, he could feel a shudder pass through the body beneath his hand. In some strange way, he was pleased with the boy's sensitivity, however ill-founded. When he was sure the others were sleeping, Gareth sat up quietly and dragged his blanket over to the fire. He placed more wood among the embers and waited till the yellow flames lapped at them in earnest. Then he drew up his knees and sat staring. They were safe enough, he knew, for Evrain had told him of the king's men guarding them on their trip, and beyond that in his new home in Kiel. Yet he was not sure if he would ever again feel the careless comfort he had known so many days before in the hills of Belruth. Everywhere he would go in the future, the dark would hold some unknown threat, for there were many who sought his life, and they were powerful enough to reach round the inland sea, even into the lands of their enemies. Still, he had escaped them 3 times, and found friends among the foes of his people. He glanced over at the sleeping forms of the 2 men. They had risked their lives to keep him safe, and they were willing to carry on doing it. This was astonishing to him. Why, even, had the king not cast him into prison? It was impossible to understand. It was a mild, sun-tide night, and he hardly needed the blanket to keep him warm. They had been walking without a doublet or coat all day long, and the wash before the even meal had been refreshing rather than cold. The chill of the high pass had been left far behind. In the open country, one rarely slept in a nightshirt only, to be semi-prepared for any eventuality, and he was wearing the black hose he had worn when fleeing Nuria. In some strange way, his Nurian clothing seemed to be the last link he had with his former home. He rose to his feet and let the blanket slip down. The stars blazed down at him in familiar constellations. Even the less-known ones seemed brighter than usual. His head hurt a little, and he felt faint. The air was heavy, pressing down on him, brushing against his cheeks. It was very quiet. The insects had ceased their din for some unknown reason. He glanced down at the fire, a question in his mind as to why there was no snapping or hiss from the burning logs. It was bright. So bright it hurt the eye to look at it, and he backed away into the shade again, where the flaming orb could not find him. The smell of blood was everywhere. The very leaves seemed to carry it above the musty jungle floor. Distant shouting to his left lured him from his hideout. He moved in silence, sliding through the creepers, the heat of Imran's orb stabbing at him here and there. Now there was smoke, and the sickly burning smell. He knew what the flames were consuming. The man lurked directly in front of him. His back was gleaming with sweat. He wore a loincloth, only a leather sheath containing a dagger dangled at his side. He hesitated for a moment, then turned his head as if to listen. Scars crossed the dark skin of his face, which was pressingly familiar. Before he drew the blade from its sheath, Gareth knew it would wear an odd twisting pattern. Fear gripped him at once. He remembered the pain, the impossible pain, and the horrible menace of the hooded man. The dark figure in front of him had to remember it also, for he did not waver when he drew the blade across the bare skin of his thigh and inflicted upon himself a long and painful cut. He did not cry out or show any sign of discomfort. Instead, he cleaned and sheathed the knife and rose to his feet. Blood pooled round the warrior's bare foot. He hardly seemed to notice it. Discarded among the leaves lay a small round shield covered with hide. A rough skull shape had been painted on it in red. the sockets staring emptily. With the symbol came a name, Amul. Gareth tried to look away, escape the blinding ache in his head. The man cried out as if in mortal peril, and broke cover. Gareth wanted to scream too, for the searing pain in his mind, for the deception of the savage man, and for the tall Viron and his fellows who had stepped into the clearing and would somehow become the victims of it. Someone had him by the shoulders and was shaking him roughly. It was mercifully dark. The sun had gone and taken the pain with it.
Wake up, boy!
The voice was vaguely familiar. He tried to sit up, and the shaking stopped. His tongue seemed made of wood.
Who were ye calling?
Lur, on his knees behind Evrain, sounded very concerned. A wave of nausea swept over him. Evrain gripped his cheeks between his thumb and fingers.
What is it, boy?
He moved to let the light from the burning logs fall on Gareth's face.
Did you have a dream?
The boy cringed away from the light and then fought to be free. In a moment he was on his hands and knees, retching.
Ye ate something bad.
Lur volunteered. He reached for a water skin and handed it to the boy. Gareth straightened up and splashed some of the water into his face. It felt amazingly good. He swallowed a mouthful and then tried again.
I am fine.
Oh, aye, and you look fine too.
Lur leaned over him, staring.
And who is this fellow you were shouting at?
What fellow?
A picture of the tall Viron appeared in his mind. He had never seen him before. Lur was adamant.
It sounded like the name, eh?
He glanced at Evrain for support.
Anik. I heard it several times.
Gareth slowly shook his head.
Never heard of him.
He swallowed down more water. Evrain looked at him quizzically, then rose to his feet.
It was a bad dream, nothing more.
It was not difficult to leave behind the burning memory of the dream once they were underway again. Day succeeded pleasant day as they made their way through the soft sun-tide countryside. Both men brightened noticeably when the gold and green of ripening fields and meadows surrounded them on every side. This was the Arran they loved, at peace, fertile, and prosperous. There were inns in which to spend the night now, and little hamlets all along the way. Gareth went hooded and cloaked through the towns of Anvie and Wingmere, and he was forbidden to speak or even look directly at any of the people. They had thought it best that he assume the role of a dim-witted runaway boy from Nuria. The locals were much less likely to perceive a threat or feel resentment if they considered him inferior. There would be no questions or attempts at intimidation. It would be best for the curious to remember a half-wit Nurian and not an inquisitive chatterbox. Gareth had insisted that there was little point to this charade, since anyone familiar with Nurians would know that he was not a half-wit. His eyes would give him away, for the worthless among his people looked like any of the nations around. They had not the gift of enhanced sight, nor the telltale cat-like eyes that went with it. All he achieved with this explanation was for Evrain to have him stare at the floor whenever they were seated in an inn or walking among townsfolk. He soon gained an extensive knowledge of Arranite footwear and paving, as well as the touch of Evrain's fingers at the back of his head to remind him to keep his face averted. There was a tight moment when they passed through Arran Rock, and the men left him seated on his own in the dining hall of a tavern. 3 men approached him and posed questions to him. He pretended not to hear or understand them, but he was not able to avoid looking at them. When Evrain came to his rescue to rid him of the pests, he was berated a little unfairly for not looking down. He remarked sulkily that he would soon grow a hump on his back from all the stooping, and Evrain retorted that it would do him good, since he needed to acquire some humility. Gareth lost control and openly ridiculed the Arranite custom of bowing and scraping before people of rank. This earned him banishment to their room without supper. Evrain softened before the evening was over, however. When he entered the room with the leftovers from supper, he found a tearful and upset boy who begged him for forgiveness in anxious tones. Gareth maintained that he had to seem like the most ungrateful wretch in all of Myrtle, but that he had not looked at the men intentionally, and that the Aaronites could bow as much as they pleased, and it did not matter to him in the least. Evrain tried to explain that the bowing was not the issue, but the boy's safety, and furthermore it was merely according the other person respect to bow. It was far from groveling. He noticed that Gareth hardly heard what he was saying, and when he made to leave, the boy clung a little hysterically to his arm till he had assured him of a complete absolution for his crimes. Since Gareth was uncharacteristically morose the next day, Evrain took him out to the harbor of Arran town, and showed him the majesty of the rock of Arran. About a mile down the coast, ragged cliffs engulfed the white sands of the beach to tower to an astonishing height. Some 100 yards out to sea, a dark citadel of rock thrust its proud head above the breakers. From the base, continually awash with a green-blue ocean, a pinnacle of rock reached to the height of the cliffs opposite, as if at some time long before they had been joined. Above the collar of boiling white, and the black stone slanted to the foot of the needle, a curtain wall and gateway had been raised. Inside it squatted a square tower of the same black stone as the islet. Above the parapet fluttered the ceremonial gold-crossed pennant of the king of Arran. Woven in the myths of their land was the tale of the birth of Palingenesis, from whom had sprung all the peoples of this realm. Here, surrounded by the wailing of the gulls and the wash of the ceaseless waves, he had been conceived from the union of Imran the warrior and the queen of all the Nereid, who carried no more name than the sky or the ocean. Here she had returned when her time was due, to be delivered of a land child she could not keep. And here still lingered the magic and mystery of that union between divinity, air, and sea. It was the heart of the realm, though it hardly belonged to the land. Evrain traced a line through the sea with an outstretched finger, where the busy water barely hid a narrow causeway of rock in swathes of white. He explained that a narrow band connected the rock with the mainland when the tide was out. It was treacherous to navigate its nearly 100 yards of barnacled, sea-swept surface, particularly for the novice driver of ox carts, or the not-so-sure of foot, especially in a blow. Several proverbs had even been coined here on the misadventures of the unfortunate. They lingered for half a day till the tide had ebbed, allowing a trickle of traffic to pass to and from the stronghold, until it was on the rise once more, sending the last of the ants scurrying off the causeway. It was long enough for Gareth to be thoroughly impressed by it all, and to forget his melancholy. He became aware of the abstract power of the place, the significance for all the inhabitants of the land. If the country had a spirit, it was most strong in this place. Once they had crossed the Black River, only 35 miles remained to their destination. A change of mood came over each of them. Evrain grew increasingly quiet, and seemed lost in thought for long periods. Lur was excited and talkative, so that his captain's silence went largely unnoticed. Gareth shared this excitement to some degree, but spells of severe apprehension regularly interrupted his jovial mood. He could not banish from his mind the tearful countenance of Riot the Witless in the face of the cruel rejection he had suffered at the hands of the people of Belruth. Would he share a similar fate? Would he at last feel the sting from which he had always tried to shield his friend? In the first hamlet, the party fell in with 20 men from Kiel, who were also on their way home after 6 seasons of service in the north. Gareth was immediately instructed to don his hood. He stood uncertainly amid the loud greetings and laughter, his eyes once more fixed on the wooden floor in the parlor of an inn. Though no one seemed to notice or refer to him, it was embarrassing in the extreme to hide from the people with whom he would probably spend the rest of his life. He made a decision. As soon as the noise subsided in his immediate vicinity, Gareth threw back the hood. Evrain stared at him, astonished.
What are you doing?
I will face them like this.
The boy looked him squarely in the eye.
They will find out sooner or later. And then they will think I'm ashamed of what I am.
He shrugged.
What can they do? Hate me? I'm used to that. Throw stones? Perhaps I will snarl at them and scare them away.
It is a serious matter. You should refrain from jesting.
Evrain had to admit to himself that there was some sense in what the boy had said.
How will I live in Kiel? Will you hide me in a shed during the day and let me out for air at night?
You are attracting attention. Keep quiet.
Evrain rubbed his chin in contemplation.
Fine. Leave the hood. But you're not to speak to anyone. You do not know the language. You are a half-wit from across the pass. Try to remember that.
Gareth flashed him a quick smile, then let it recede to a stupid grin.
Now you look the part. Stop staring at everything and everyone, and it will be even more convincing.
Evrain was the center of attraction in the dining hall that evening. He was popular enough, and the recent misfortune with his son brought several more of his neighbors than usual to express sympathy and support. Many a curious glance were cast in the direction of the strange, silent boy, and ere long he had to explain how he had come by this oddity from Nuria. Gareth kept his eyes averted during these revelations, enjoying the shock and surprise of the Aaronites in secret. Some looked at him as if he might be poisonous, but he received a sympathetic pat or two from the men of milder temperament. This surprised him in turn, to such an extent that he had to refrain from smiling at them. He was sure that that was not allowed. The next morning Evrain lingered over breakfast, to allow the rest of the men a head start. He wanted to spare Gareth the effort of containing himself on the approach to Kiel. Besides, he did not desire to experience this sad homecoming in a crowd. It would be difficult enough facing his wife, Mirael, and his little daughter after his 6-season absence. Though the king had granted him a postponement on his service, he had fled the unbearable grief, the self-blame, and escaped with Lur to the north and the forgetfulness of the pass. Now he felt like a deserter, a coward, who had shirked his duty to his family and seen only to his own needs. Simply thinking about Mirael was painful. The road to Kiel stretched along the coast, occasionally dipping between the foothills of squat sandstone mountains. These were tall hills compared to the mighty ranges of the north, mounds of green grasses and shrubs, crowned with the rough, weather-worn white of the stone. Clumps of pine and fir trees, none of great height or age, congregated here and there. The soil was sandy and shallow, causing the taller trees to fall under the pressure of the southwestern gales. Soon the mountains crowded in on them, forcing the road to hug the shoreline closely. They passed through a hamlet called Tunstay, and to Lur's disgust, Evrain decided to remain there for the night. Their deliberately slow pace had made them fall behind the other men, and it was now apparent that Lur's impatience to reach Kiel was matched equally by Evrain's reluctance. That night the captain kept to himself, retiring to bed after the second watch, and then with a face red from heavy drinking. He arose late and bleary-eyed, stirring only when Lur threatened to fetch men from Kiel to carry him home. It was hard to believe that such a dramatic change could come over a man. He avoided their eyes and would not speak. Lur forced him from the bed to the washroom to the table, where he hardly ate before they were underway once more. Lur kept up the steady stream of conversation throughout the day. Gareth was more than happy to join him, bursting with curiosity about his new home as he was. Dragging the silent Evrain behind, They spoke of the sea, the tides, the varieties of fish with their seasons, till the Nurian boy could not wait to feel the planking of a boat beneath his feet. The blue sky and ocean, the bright high suntide day, coupled with the peculiar smell of brush and soil, reeds and sea, that only this region boasted, joined forces to bring Evrain out of his somber mood. Ere long he was jesting with them, vying with Lur to name and expound on the meaning of each of the oddly shaped sandstone crests along their way. Gareth tried his best to keep up, but after a while he was not sure whether the sculpted mountains were being named in earnest or not. A particularly imposing head loomed to their left as they took a modest turn inland. The greyish stone wore features reminiscent of a human face, complete with eye sockets and a broad nose. It towered several hundred yards above the bay it protected, and was bordered on each shoulder by a smaller stone-pocked hill of green. Evrain, who was now walking abreast of them, put a warning hand on Lur's arm and posed the question to Gareth.
What estimable visitor would you say that mountain resembles?
He winked at Lur. Gareth, intrigued by their poorly hidden conspiracy, and baffled by the many ridiculous names and expositions of the afternoon, did not know what to expect. He pretended to examine the outcrop extensively. The sides could be construed as hair, or a cape, if one had the inclination of seeing it as a person. Yet the curvature of stone flanking the face at once reminded him of the short-horned cattle of eastern Nuria.
A cow?
He ventured uncertainly. Both men burst out into uproarious laughter. Lur actually sank to his knees and started slapping the road with one hand. Evrain was bent double and struggling to catch his breath. Gareth stood staring at them in astonishment, hands on hips, not understanding at all what they found so hilarious. He was a little annoyed at being baited into saying something silly. As soon as they calmed down a bit, he tried again.
A pig?
This was evidently in the same category as his first response, or perhaps even worse, for Lur ended up on his back howling with mirth, while Evrain had to sit down next to him and wipe away the tears with his sleeve. When he had regained some control, he addressed the indignant boy.
Stop! Stop! This is high treason!
At this, Lur laughed so much that he had to undo the clasps of his pack and hold onto his stomach. He pointed a finger at Gareth between gasps for air.
Listen, you little country pumpkin, a cow,
He coughed painfully.
and the pig. Why not a sow?
Now Evrain had to follow his example and release the straps of his own pack as well. He laughed so loudly that a sparrow rose complaining from a thicket beside the road. Gareth could contain himself no longer. He sat down next to Evrain.
Why didn't you just tell me what is so funny?
Both men laughed till they were sore before either would answer. In the end, Lur offered an unsatisfactory explanation.
The mother of our dear King Ranald, who you've met, has, how to put it, thinks very highly of herself.
And her appearance, despite her imposing size and advancing age.
Evrain put in.
In recent times, the last cycle or two, she's had several streams and roadways,
He gestured in the direction of the peak.
even a mountain or so, forcibly renamed in her honor.
Ismelda the Fair.
Evrain spoke with disgust.
That peak is called Lemoan, meaning the bull in the language of the watermen. It has been called that for hundreds of cycles. That offensive woman considers no one and nothing but her vanity, and has made herself very unpopular in the south.
Lur chimed in again.
So your guess was most appropriate. No longer the bull, but the cow.
He sniggered loudly, dabbing at his eyes.
Oh,
Having no experience of the scourge of Ismelda the Fair, Gareth could muster no more than a smile in response. Evrain slapped an arm round his shoulder.
What say we go take a look from up there? It is but 3 miles distant from Kiel, but there's no better place from which to view the town.
Ignoring Lur and his rolling eyes, he jumped to his feet, hoisted the boy up by his bedroll, and extended his hand to the older man. Ler sat looking at him for a moment before grasping the proffered hand. He knew this detour would probably mean another night away from home. There was not much in the way of firewood among the crags and rough stone fingers that bristled up to 15 feet tall on the mountain top. The travelers had to make do with a small cooking fire, which turned out to be a smoky affair, since they had to use green wood in abundance. In the end, they settled for bread and apples brought from the Tunstay Inn, and stomped out the ruin of a campfire. It was a breathless night, and they sat close to the edge of the cliff, their backs against the sandstone slabs. Some of the heat of the day was still trapped in these gray pillars, and they felt the comfort of it. Above them was the mass of the stars, like a sable field sown with seeds of white fire. Below them stretched the dark earth and sea, whose breathing roar surrounded them, and the amber lights of Kiel, a spreading blanket of coals, winking from windows and courtyards. The bay curved on their right, a sickle of land, its keen edge the white sands of a 4-mile stretch of beach. The lights of habitation ranged from the foothills behind Lemoine, round the curve of sand to the opposite side of the bay. Behind these was the dark of hills and mountains, till the point of the sickle rose in a mound not dissimilar to the one on which they were seated. Mirren, the watermen called it, the Calf. Gareth could make out the surging white of breakers along the rocky waterline of its base. There were no lights there. Evrain was completely silent. He sat breathing deeply, his head tilted back and his eyes closed as if asleep. As a child he had spent many a night on this outcrop, imagining the adventures he would undertake as a man. Now he longed for nothing but rest and forgetfulness. The fates had conspired to rob him of the taste for the unknown, the danger of unexplored places. Even the sea had become his enemy, stealing away the life of his child, tearing love from him till only the bare rock remained. There it lay below like a dark monster, insatiable and restless, eagerly awaiting the next sacrifice. But he had nothing left to give it, nothing left. He thought of Mirael and Lay. He had lost them too, he was sure. Perhaps he had wanted to. She blamed him. They both did. He should have known better. He should have stayed home on such a day. And who could tell with the sea? Who could predict the size of the odd swell and the force of the sudden gust? Who could say when the strength of a proud man should fail till he could no longer bear the drowned body of his son to the shore? Yet he should have known better, and for not knowing he was perched upon the mountain top, wishing he was 1,000 miles away from the home he now dreaded to see again. A bright white and blue morning greeted the three travelers. The sun rising behind their backs, they watched the light flooding through the claws of stone to the bay below. And claws they were, for the bull now resembled a lion at rest, its rear towards the Bay of Kiel, its right shoulder and paw extended into the ocean, its left tucked underneath its gigantic body. The small houses of the town marked its right flank and curving hind legs. The shadow of its head fell deep into the bay. Evrain did not linger on the peak. He pointed out the daytime features of the place most hurriedly. A small river emptied into the sea on the far side of the beach. The vivid green, with its many houses behind the sand strip, obscured a small patch of marshland. The wooden pier and imposing stone sea wall of the harbor, the scores of boats riding at anchor or drawn up onto the sand. His face was set and stubborn, as if he had prepared himself for the battles of the coming day. His mood affected all three of them, so that they hardly spoke on the way down. Kiel was little more than a fishing village, home to but 1,000 Aaronites, and perhaps 500 of the strange Myrden, or watermen as the locals called them. These peculiarities of the southern coast of Erin could be found as far as Ambervent in the West March, living in small communes of their own, sometimes attached to villages or towns of other races. They were set apart by their language and appearance, and mostly by their aloofness, stemming from an almost symbiotic relationship with the sea. Fine-boned, slim and tall, the Myrden resembled no other people around the inland sea. The men were beardless as their women. All had the characteristic brown skin, with an almost coppery hue in the light of the sun, and their hair, which ranged from silvery white to a darker gray, was worn long and loose. Some gossips held that they did this to hide the fact that they had no ears, but those familiar with them knew that the small ears of the Myrden were esteemed as an object of beauty, and covering them was a sign of modesty. Men and women of this race were unequaled in their ability in the water, able to stay underwater many times as long as the most skilled fishermen of the town, and agile beyond comparison in the deep. They were employed in robbing oysters of their locked-up treasures. Occasionally they were called upon to salvage a cargo from a shallow-lying wreck, since they could reach deeper than the men of the town. Many fishing captains also kept at least one as part of their crew, for there was no grumbling if the need arose to go into the water after a snag, net, or line. Apart from Lur and formerly Evrain's son Zane, the two remaining crew members on Evrain's boat were watermen. Melor and Ulan were fiercely and extraordinarily loyal to the Aaronite, having crewed for him for more than 5 cycles. Most Myrden fishermen moved from boat to boat, rarely staying with one captain for a second cycle. This behavior typified their social interaction with the townsfolk. They had their own market and taverns, where the particular delicacies from the ocean that they enjoyed were sold and served. Here a stranger would be rudely ignored, and if he would be so foolish as to cause trouble, would soon become acquainted with the meaning of the waterman way. He would be left well alone for perhaps a 10-day, after which misfortune would overtake him in some degree equivalent to the harm he had done. The secretive, lingering meting out of justice was frowned upon by the authorities, but generally very effective. In the same way, Myrden women were seldom approached by men of other races, for the fear of unexpected retribution always lurked. Many a drunken sailor or townsman had been overtaken by misadventure on the slippery quayside, and subsequently drowned after attempts at practicing their unwanted charms on the comely wives and daughters of their unforgiving neighbors. The Myrden quarter lay to the south of the main town, and Evrain's house touched the invisible borders of it. It was a sizable place, perched on the flank of Limoan and facing west, with a walled courtyard and several outbuildings. These contained the stored nets and gear used in his trade, as well as racks and barrels for drying or pickling fish. The main road ran behind it, leaving an unobstructed view of the bay. The breakers of the ocean nearly washed the low wall in front. The place smelled of dried seagrass and bracken, fish and sun-seasoned stone. It was open and bright, from the stunted pines to the wind-combed brush and tall reeds. Loose gray boulders sprawled among the gorse. This was tranquility. Evrain was visibly tense by now. His brow was furrowed in dejection, his body slouched along tiredly. Lur, who lived but 3 houses away, accompanied them to Evrain's gate. All seemed quiet round the home. The gate was barred from inside. A copper ship's bell was suspended from a weathered wooden arm above the gate. Evrain loosened the cord and sounded the bell impatiently. A door opened somewhere inside, and footsteps hurried across the yard. Lur's voice was low, careful.
You can stay with me.
No, he will stay here, as I originally decided.
Lur shifted his feet uncomfortably.
Would it not be better to spare Mirail's feelings?
Spare her feelings? What are you talking about? You've said it yourself. This is not some replacement for our son.
There was something almost hysterical in his voice. Gareth wished he could disappear. He had no desire to become the center of a family quarrel. He half hoped that Evrain would take Lur's advice and let him escape this zone of conflict, where raw feelings would beat about him all day and night. He knew little of Evrain's loss and the circumstances surrounding it, but the grief and mourning of the man had been apparent from their first meeting. Now the tension and reluctance to return had grown to something as palpable. He had no desire to aggravate the situation. A metal bolt was drawn back, the latch clicked sharply, and the gate swung open. Out rushed a little girl of perhaps 7 or 8 cycles. She flung her arms around Evrain's waist and buried her face in his shirt. The man put his hands on her head, his eyes fixed on the tall, dark-haired woman standing in the gateway. He spoke gruffly, almost challenging.
Mirail?
Welcome home, Evrain. Lur?
She nodded at the older man, but her words were heavy, lifeless. Dark rings shadowed her eyes. Her shoulders sagged. Only her hands were moving, nervously rubbing each other. She looked at their companion, and a shock passed through her, widening her dull eyes slightly. Gareth looked down immediately, uncertain as to what role he was to play here. Should he speak, or continue the muted charade of the road? He glanced at Evrain, immobilized by his daughter's embrace and his own conflicting emotions. There would be no guidance for the moment. There was no guidance for some time to come. The first 10 days in Evrain's home was as difficult a time as Gareth had experienced. He kept his conversation restricted to answering questions, and then only in monosyllables. Mirail and Lay ignored his existence, having only half understood or accepted Evrain's mumbled explanations for his presence there. Doubtless they regarded him as an intruder at a sensitive period in their lives. In fact, it was almost inevitable as time wore on that his being there at all would be seen as a pathetic attempt by Evrain to replace his loss. During the day, at least, they could escape the awkwardness and brooding atmosphere in the house. Evrain plunged himself into his trade with an exaggerated enthusiasm, rounding up his crew the very day after he arrived. Lur, Maelor, and Ulan met them in the early morning shadow of the pier, where Evrain's boat had been beached during his absence. Gareth could not help staring at the unfamiliar forms of the Murden men. Their skins were the color of weathered wood, and Maelor, the younger of the two by 10 cycles, had the silky white hair one would expect to find on the aged. His hair was smooth and long, though, reaching halfway down his back. Both were dressed in triangular-shaped breechclouts, over which they wore loose-fitting, shirt-like garments of unbleached linen, striped with fading deep blue. The sleeves were loose and short, and once they had risen to their feet, Gareth could see that the tunics hardly reached to the thigh. The men went bare-legged, as all the fishermen of the southern coast did. Well-worn leather sandals, tied up to the ankle only, completed their costume. The men rose to their feet as Evrain approached, and there was a solemn moment as each in turn grasped his hand. The usual joy of a reunion had been omitted for the while. They raised their eyebrows at the sight of Gareth, though Lur had certainly warned them about him beforehand. They spoke their names slowly as they grasped his hand, and he wondered what Lur had told them about his supposed mental condition. They seemed friendly enough, though, and as unconcerned about his nationality as if he had been an Aranite. He took an instant liking to them. Evrain's boat, the Sunsway, was a typical version of the South Coast fisherman, and for good reason. Its 30-foot length and 9-foot beam was a standard requisite to enter the race from keel to Aran Rock, held on the last 10th day of hunting each cycle. There was fierce competition among the men of all the coastal towns, for the winner was highly regarded, and richly rewarded with a purse from the crown. The prevailing southwesterly breezes of late suntide allowed for the completion of the race in 2 or 3 days, at the end of which one exhausted crew would reach the breakwater at the rock in the first place. Evrain had won the race twice as a young man, in his 22nd and 24th cycle, and had been close to it on several occasions since. Of such importance was this event to Evrain that Lur had placed all his hopes on it, to draw his friend back from the dark contemplations that now so soured his temperament. He spoke with energy as they rounded the upturned hull, inspecting the fur planking for signs of weakness and wear. With the race a bare 25 days off, there was much work to be done, and with a new member on the crew, they would have to do it in a hurry. Balor and Yulan were as eager as Lur to get the boat seaworthy. They had never been on Evrain's winning team. Some even said that having 2 watermen on board had brought the young captain ill fortune. This cycle would be the end of all the silly jesting that was presently going on at their expense. Evrain, however, displayed a sudden reluctance to touch the Sunsway. While the others rubbed here and there, pointed and stroked, he held back, nodding now and then in agreement, his eyes a little vacant. From time to time he was caught staring out to sea, and a question or remark would have to be repeated. They had a good store of dried Progeny leaf, as the watermen had already started work in anticipation some days before. The rough, hard texture of the fronds would help the planking regain a highly polished look and feel, essential for gaining the edge over less meticulous competitors. Balor and Yulan donned sealskin gloves they stored with the leaves, pulled the loose shirts over their heads, and grabbing a handful of leaves, set to with energy. Lur motioned to Gareth to follow their example, taking care to supervise the boy's work while doing his own. Not a single rough spot were to remain on the hull, while the planking ought not to be weakened with blades or stone. It was hard work, and a hot day on top of it, though high suntide and thus the greatest heat was past. Ere long Gareth realized why the men had discarded their shirts, for his own was becoming soaked in sweat. Lur kept up a stream of instructions and observations as they worked, and he soon became acquainted with the particularities of hull design and upkeep, the customs and oddities of watermen, and the history of the Sunsway. Often Lur would point at the other 2 workers with his eyes, and speak under his breath of their love for the heat of the sun, their magical abilities under the surface of the sea, their dislike for interference in their affairs.
Like lizards they are, for the heat.
He would whisper.
To get the chill of the water out of them, I reckon. Spend hours in the sea they can, and then lie in the sun for the rest of the day.
At some stage they removed their shirts as well, and Gareth could feel the pressing heat on his shoulders. He admitted to Lur that he had spent many hours basking in it himself with Riot. At the same time he shot a glance at Evrain, wondering if the others were allowed to see him speak. The captain stood with his arms folded, staring at them unseeingly. He turned back to Lur.
Will we also wear those?
He winked in the direction of the watermen's discarded shirts. Lur smiled.
They're called rain, which is something like skin of cloth, and we all wear them. A bit more appropriate, wouldn't you say?
He wiped his sweaty brow as proof.
The breech clout is called Wen, the sandals are called Eden, the gutting knife is called Vig, and I cannot remember what they're all supposed to mean.
He stopped scouring the wood for a moment and put his hands on his hips.
Every boat has its own color and design. It is a matter of pride to wear the blue stripes, no mistake.
Gareth welcomed the breather.
Every boat.
27 in Kiel alone. Round the coast it must be close to 200, and each with its colors. At the race, it's something to see.
How many men to a boat?
Gareth let go the bunch of leaves and worked his fingers back and forth to get rid of the cramping.
5 or 6, mostly 5, though there are smaller boats with 2 men only. But the real racing is done with the larger boats like this one.
He knocked affectionately on the hull.
How is it that you are not wearing the colors today?
We came to take a look only, didn't we? I should have known it would be a close and exhausting one.
He laughed and bent over his task once more. Gareth did not quite feel up to it again. It was tedious work and strenuous if properly done.
My arm has little strength left.
Swap it to your left then.
I have. They're both aching badly now.
Lur smiled broadly.
You'll get used to it.
It would be a while before he did. The polishing of the round-bottomed hull took the better part of 4 days, while the late afternoons and evenings were spent checking and mending nets and sails. Lur's good-natured wife, Naira, had supplied Gareth with garb in the colors of Evrain's boat. It was an immense relief to dress as the other fishermen did. No longer would he feel quite as awkward around the harbor or town. The 5th day after his arrival in Kiel, the 10th day, Evrain took him out on the water in a smaller boat. It was a brave venture, for the day was breezy and unforgiving towards the mistakes they were bound to make. Evrain was reserved but kind, as he explained and demonstrated the harnessing of the wind and the skillful tacking necessary to keep the sails filled. He had the boys steer with the tiller, changing course on his command, timing the swing of the boom with precision. Then they changed places. Gareth nervously fumbled the first tacks, but soon had the boat coming about like a seasoned sailor. Reaching into the wind on their way back was far trickier, and more than once they were close-hauled and drifting before they achieved any sort of harmony. Lur, who had kept an eye on them all the while, was there to congratulate them in mocking tones once they landed. He was impressed, though, with the light-hearted greeting he received from Evrain. It was as if old times had returned. When Evrain learned that Gareth was not quite sure whether he could swim well or not, he insisted on the boy spending an hour each morning and each night in the ocean. By the next 10th day, he wanted to see him swim the 4 miles across the bay without stopping. Gareth bemoaned his lot with Lur, who summarily referred him to Maelor for a lesson or two. The waterman was more than willing to help, surprised though he was to find out that the Nurian boy was no simpleton after all. For his part, Gareth was inspired by the supple swiftness of the Myrddin in the water, and readily accepted their assurances that nothing dangerous or sinister lurked just beneath the surface of the sea to devour any casual trespasser. Ere long, he started enjoying his swimming sessions and imagined himself as one of these amazing creatures he had come to admire so. The townsfolk took little notice of him, not knowing where to place him, and this made him feel closer still to the sea people. Their calm and unperturbed manner was infectious, till one felt completely at ease when they were in the vicinity. Yulan had a dry sense of humor, which he regularly displayed when Gareth was nearby, for the boy seemed to enjoy his remarks in a way only a non-Aeronite could. Both men confided in him concerning Evrain. They could hardly recognize the silent, almost sullen man as the erstwhile fun-loving and energetic captain. He had acquired a new and disturbing habit of lingering in taverns before returning home late at night. He drank too much and spoke too little. Gareth had seen this for himself, and also the deteriorating relationship at Evrain's house. There was shouting now, sometimes, that made him glad his room was in the front and had a thick wooden door. He would stop up his ears, embarrassed to witness such degrading behavior from a man he respected so much. The real joy came only once the hull had been smoothed and pitched inside, coated with resin outside and polished to a shine. The tall spruce mast was fitted in its copper sleeve and bolted down with care. The centerboard had received the same attention as the hull and slipped gleaming into its socket. New rope shrouds from Greenmere replaced the old, while all the copper fittings were cleaned and coated with resin. When the sun's sway finally rested on the slipway, it looked and felt like a new boat. Even the captain was caught up in the excitement of launching, and when the blue striped sails unfurled in the stiffening breeze, all hearts on board were beating fast and free. Lur had remained on the pier to check the raking and curvature of the mast, since the shrouds had all been replaced and would need adjusting. He would signal from time to time, and Evrain would tighten or slacken the stays as necessary. He explained the procedure as best he could to Gareth, who was soon lost in the complexities of it. All the boy wanted to do was run before the wind as fast as the boat would go. Indeed, this seemed all the Sunsway herself wanted to do. She eagerly caught the wind in her sails, leaning against her centerboard, till Evrain had to put her about with rapid regularity, or they would sail too far from the pier for Lur's signals to be seen. Gareth felt the tense energy in the deck planks aft. The quivering stays stirred his own liveliness, till Evrain ordered him to sit still or be tossed overboard. He retorted saucily that he was ready to swim across the bay anyhow. The man sarcastically asked him to oblige them with a demonstration, upon which Gareth laughingly removed his rein and leaned over the side. Evrain used the sailor's term on him and told the watermen to tie him up, and cast him into the fishbins beneath the bow deck. This they proceeded to do without ceremony, while Lur's baffled voice reached them across the water, demanding to know what their idea was, and if he would have to stand there waving all day as they sailed round in circles. The bright landscape of Kiel held a lingering shadow or two. Gareth had completed his second daily swim one eventide, and went looking for Evrain in the Black Sail, an older tavern just off the beach. He disliked these searches intensely, for he was forced to act a half-wit, while quite often having to look for the man in more than one alehouse. Evrain seldom ate at home these days, and would take a meal in one place, only to saunter over to the next for another mug or two of ale. The patrons would invariably stare at the boy as he entered the place to scan the tables and counter with his eyes. He feared the day when Evrain would be too inebriated to recognize or accompany him. He would not ask them for aid, but go straight to Lur. He had even arranged it with the older man. The Black Sail seemed to have become Evrain's preferred drinking place. The food was not the best, but it was gloomy inside, while the crowd here was of poorer and humbler stock than elsewhere. To Gareth's frustration, Evrain was not nearly ready to stumble home yet when he arrived. He sat down opposite the man and proceeded to stare at him. Evrain rudely told him to go take a walk, for he could not stand looking at his cheerful face all the time. The boy departed reluctantly, suspecting that this might be the night his fears came true. The sun was setting in golden splendor across the water. He was happy, at least, to be out of the stifling air of the alehouse. With nothing better to do, he followed Evrain's suggestion and headed down the beach to where it ended abruptly in woodland. On the margin of it ran the river they had seen from the top of Lemoine. The water ran a dark, deep brown in color, a result of the diversity of shrubs and reeds on its shores. It was little more than a stream, quite shallow in places, and easy to ford. On the far bank, a thicket of stunted milkwood sprawled over the lower reaches of the adjacent mountains. Gareth took off his rein and waded across. At one stage, the water reached up to his armpits, and he held the garment above his head to prevent it from getting wet. He understood by now why the folk of Kiel were attired in this way. He was in and out of the tunic throughout the day, as he was in and out of the water. He smiled to think that he had to sneak away for a swim in Belruth. Now he was a regular waterman. A ghostly quiet lay over the twisted trees and clumps of reeds beyond. He entered nonetheless, hoping for some hint of the tranquil mirror pool he had left behind on the other side of the sea. The air seemed close under the canopy. Not a single tree trunk was straight or simple in form, but all bent this way and that in gnarled knots and odd angles. They were covered in thick moss, which probably gave the place its musty, decaying smell. The bed of dried leaves rustled beneath his bare feet as he took small, slow steps into the murk. He had not gone a quarter-mile before he felt a prickling up his spine and halted abruptly. The sensation that he was being observed was overwhelming. He had been warned about the king's men and their vigil, and had welcomed it in this land, but what he sensed now was altogether different. An invisible threat lurked nearby. Perchance some vagabond from Kiel. He searched the dark, keeping his breathing shallow and noiseless. It was so still the pounding of his heart seemed to inhibit his hearing, and he placed a hand over it as if to lessen the noise. Out of the corner of his eye he caught a quick, flitting movement between two contorted trunks some 30 paces away. His heart lurched under his fingers. He stood motionless. Then, right in front of his eyes, he saw a figure slip from behind one tree to disappear behind another. The rustling of leaves came to his ears, and he waited no longer. He heard the footfalls as he ran, and the heavy breathing. Finally, as he broke the line of trees and plunged into the water, a snarling hiss of frustration was all that reached after him. On the opposite bank, a tall figure lowered his longbow and stalked off without looking back. The third day after his encounter in the Milkwood, Gareth finally had to summon Lur to his aid in getting Evrain home. The latter was not noisy as many drunks were, but simply stared in front of him with glassy eyes. Nor would his legs support his weight as they dragged him from the bench, and they were forced to carry him between them. It was a difficult 2 miles back home, and even more difficult when they arrived there. Mirail had to be woken up before letting them in. She refused to touch her husband or let him in her bedroom. Lur and Gareth had to put him in a guest room, where he started snoring as soon as they placed him on a bed. All the while Mirail looked at Gareth, as if he was to blame for the whole episode, or at least had some large part to play in it. He avoided her eyes, and removed himself to his room as soon as Lur had left. It was a stiflingly hot night, and the long struggle with Evrain had added tenfold to his discomfort. He pulled off the rein and threw open the large windows of his room to let in what he hoped would be cool night air. He had half a mind to go back down to the beach for a swim, but remembered the bowman and whatever had chased him in the wood too vividly. He replaced the damp wen with a dry one, and flung himself onto the bed. Sleeping would be a struggle in itself this night. He spread his arms wide, and tried to imagine the gentle rocking motion of the sunsway sailing free. His mind was whirling with names and knowledge of spars and rigging, while his body ached with the intensity of the unfamiliar exercise to which it was subjected every day. He was doing a man's work now, or as close to it as he could. His body was quickly growing harder, stronger, and he smiled to think of the airbow in Belruth that he had not been able to bend. If he could have another try at it. He sat up swiftly. Something had touched the open shutter outside. A bat? Perchance the wind was stirring at last to drive away the oppressive heat. There was no sound now. His nerves tingled and stirred in the pit of his stomach. What if the thing in the forest had slipped past the bowman? He slid off the bed and drew the wig from his discarded girdle. He would peep outside quickly, and if there was something, he would... What would he do? Evrain was in no state to come to his aid. If the bowman had failed, he was alone. Gripping the knife in a shaking hand, he crept towards the open window. There was a new sound, subtle but unmistakable, a booted heel on loose stones. Then there were several sounds. The whirring and thud of an arrow striking home, the stifled groan of a wounded man, hurrying feet over the gravelled stones, all followed in quick succession. He was at the window when 2 more arrows, launched from different directions, converged on a loping figure that cleared the sea wall just in time to avoid them. A moment later a night owl called, and was answered somewhere below by the shore. Another figure broke cover to his right, and brushed forcefully through the shrub and grass, there being no more need for stealth. Gareth slumped down on the windowsill and stared into the moonlight. He wondered who his protectors were, Uthart's men, or the king's, perchance both. He certainly did not need to concern himself any longer with the prowlers here. He could leave the window open and not wonder at every little cricket moving in the night. In the light of early morning he found the dark blood outside his window, and the trail leading over the sea wall. If his would-be assailant had escaped the bowmen, he would not make another attempt for some time. His mind wandered to the king of Nuria and his relentless pursuit. How could it be that a father could feel such malice towards a son? Would he not rest before there were more broken bones suspended in some tree? He folded his arms and leaned on the wall. His immense disappointment and sadness at Fingor's betrayal was settling at last into hate. He would think of it no more, but float free with the tide beyond the reach of the madman of Belruth.
Gildrath will not muster.
Fingor snarled out his frustration and flung the goblet against the far wall.
This is the final insult. This is not mere insubordination. This is insurrection.
They want a truth council on the matter before anything is decided.
Talon's voice was dry as his throat. He glanced at where the deep red liquid trickled onto the carpet.
And where shall we find witnesses for this precious council?
The king was quite red in the face, working himself into a towering rage. Quester Talon spoke slowly and deliberately, as if to a sluggish student.
They are merely stalling. I'm afraid that the death of the prince may no longer be of any use to us, though.
Not? How so?
The priest continued in the same passive tone.
Because he is not dead. And Byron knows this.
Fingor merely stared at the old man, unable to speak.
Border guards spotted him in the pass on the far side of Keris. According to them, a young deserter of the guard magically eluded them. Reports from Aaron confirmed his arrival there.
Now Fingor could muster an exclamation of surprise.
Aaron!
He has been taken by their soldiers.
You are quite sure it is the boy?
I am sure.
Talon pursed his lips.
Yet it seems that they have no idea who he is, or we would have heard their gloating already.
The king started pacing up and down, frowning. He stopped abruptly and faced the priest.
And if he reveals himself?
Talon shrugged.
We may dispute it, an Aaronite scheme to forestall an invasion, but I doubt if he would be so brave. There would be the fear that we would catch up to him there, or that the Aaronites might trade him for some concession, or even that they would cast him into a dark hole for some future bargain.
Can you see where this caused? Can you see it?
Fingor's voice was cold as ice.
How did I marry that woman? How did it come about that her offspring would get into a position to hurt my plans? Who conspired to bring this about?
He took a step closer.
Who?
Talon folded his arms.
You are overreacting, as usual. The boy is no longer a concern of ours. Neither do we have to use him to justify our war. He was a convenient enough pretext for the wavering lords, and so it is a pity.
A pity? Have you forgotten our bargain with Tyrallan? Have you forgotten their requirements?
Fingor forced himself to stay calm.
If they still want him, they know where to find him. That was our part of the bargain, was it not? And if he should perish in Aaron, well, that would be a handsome turn of affairs.
Fingor raised his eyebrows. It would indeed.
But what of the Truth Council?
The old man did not respond immediately. Instead, he installed himself on one of the chairs in the king's study.
Why don't you have them replace that goblet for you? And we can speak at our leisure.
When he had set the king's mind at ease, Talon removed himself to his own quarters for his much-needed rest. It was close to the third watch already, but then he required only a few hours of sleep. He dismissed the drowsy guard at his door with a nod, and woke his servant to aid him with disrobing. The heavy garment of the High Quester was worn even during suntide, and Talon was one to stand on tradition, even if it meant his own discomfort. In fact, he was proud to endure a little pain, in whatever subtle form, for the sake of his office and the good of the realm. This included keeping most of his concerns to himself, and not burdening Fingor with them. The king was under enough pressure as it was. He had not told Fingor about the hardening attitude of Teoric in Ligurium, of the dark suspicions voiced by their supposed co-conspirator, and the demands made by him in the newly acquired province of Lysan. Neither had he related his misgivings regarding their allies in Tyrallan. Malak Yulian's agents had become too bold and aggressive for his liking. Did their changing manner reflect their master's mood? His robe was removed with care and carried without touching the ground to its stand. He washed his face and hands in a bowl of rose-scented water and took the towel from his waiting servant. After changing into the clean nightshirt that had been aired and warmed for him, and dismissing the servant, the High Quester strode over to his window and opened the shutters as he had done every night of his almost 19 cycles in office. In a low, mumbling voice, he pronounced blessings upon the earth and air, the water and spirit of Nuria. Next, in a louder tone, he cursed our many enemies, without and within, especially those of his own race, seduced by the profane and dark art. In conclusion, he interceded for the king and his humble servant the High Quester, that they would be strengthened and resolved in what had to be done for the good of the realm. Turning away slowly, his gaze lingered on the twin moons almost directly overhead. Lauren gazed back at him in grim silence. An unspoken challenge hung in the air. Talon extinguished the wall lamp carefully. He kept the one on his table burning through the night. It was an old habit which had grown to a kind of celebration of the triumph of light over darkness, even while night prevailed. For a moment his shadow moved overlarge against the wall, then shrank to his stooping measure as he reached the bedside. He reclined his tired body on his bed and leaned back against the pillows. His rest was well-deserved. Never before had a High Quester of Nuria been in such a position as he was. His long career as priest and diplomat had brought him here. His vision and indefatigable work ethic had seen him through. Soon Ligurium would be reduced to a Nurian province, and the greatest prize of all could then be seized, the conquest of the barbarian hordes of Aran. He sighed in contentment. The realm would be secure and at peace. No king or priest had been able to achieve that since the summoning. Outside his window a sudden breeze stirred. It gathered momentum over the tiles of the roof, scurried over the large stones of the wall, and leaped between the open shutters into the room. Then, as Lauren's eyes looked on, it snuffed out the lamp with cunning fingers. High Quester Talon was left in the dark.